If that's true, Rick, was it worth it in the end?
No.
Still wasn't worth
it. What this did, I saw a great article one time. It had 6 people that were accused of misconduct there, and it said, let me introduce you to the 6 people who have lost the war. Because this threatened to destroy everything that we were trying to do there. It just gave us a severe black eye, and it's something which we have not recovered from. We may never recover from. It will take us years to put this back together. As I said before, it was an aberration. Now, what went on in the interrogations room, and you made that point, Melissa, is very good. What went on in the interrogation room was completely different from what we saw in all those pictures. That was just misconduct, and those people should be held accountable.
I want to put up now, and I'm going to ask our director, Michael Smith, to do this. There was a public opinion survey taken. 27,000 respondents in 25 different countries around the world. This is a BBC GlobeScan PIPA poll. And let's bring this up if we can, because this is going to show different attitudes on the use of force around the world. Now, these bars are a little tricky, so let's go through this if we can here. The country on the far left, that's us, Canada. 74% of those surveys were opposed to all forms of force. 22% of Canadians surveyed thought some degree of force was permissible. Now, how does that stack up compared to the world average? Only 59% opposed to all forms, so I guess we're a little more humane in that respect. 29%, however, thought some degree of force was permissible. Let's continue across towards the right. The United States of America, 58% opposed to all forms of force under all circumstances. 36%, a relatively high number, thought some degree of force was permissible. In France, 75% totally opposed. 19%, a very small number, thought some degree of force permissible. In Chile, where of course in the last quarter century they have had their experiences with torture, 62% today opposed to all forms of force. 22% say some degree of force was permissible. How about in 3 countries which have, shall we say, controversial governments today? In Iraq, 55% opposed to all forms of force. 42%, a relatively high number, thought some degree of force was permissible. In China, 49% and 37%, not much of a split there. And in Russia, 43% and 37%, some relatively high degrees of acceptance there. And how about the highest and the lowest? In Israel, 48% were opposed to all forms of force. 43%, the highest number of any country surveyed, thought some degree of force was permissible. And look at the Italians, 81% opposed to all forms of force. Only 14% found some degree of force permissible. Okay, Melissa, you're the political scientist here. I would like to know, first of all, how would you explain what kind of thinking goes into being open to the use of force?
Well, I think the openness to the use of force is a function of fear. I think that you see that very clearly. There's a general contrast among the countries that were represented in those polls between the democratic countries and the non-democratic countries, with a higher degree of tolerance for torture in the non-democratic countries. So that's already one way of explaining the difference. But then Israel had a very high degree of tolerance for torture.
And the United States.
And the United States.
Two democratic countries.
2 democratic countries, but in climates of intense political fear for national security. We've been living in a time when fears around national security have been stoked up in the post 9/11 period, and so it's that wasn't chronologically comparative data. It'd be interesting to see how those numbers would have looked a decade earlier, and I would put money on the wager that the numbers were significantly higher in both the U.S. and in Canada than they would have been before 9/11.
Mark, again, in one of your pieces that I read, you suggested we're dealing with 2 clashing sensibilities here, the warrior and the civilian. Do you see that reflected in those numbers we just showed?
I do to some extent, because I think some of the disparity, I think, as Melissa suggested, is culturally based. But I think that the numbers that you see in Israel and the United States are very clearly because the citizens of these countries, myself included, are most often targets of terrorism. And I suspect if they had taken this poll in the months after 9/11 in the United States, you would have seen a much greater tolerance for the use of coercion or torture. And I think that would be true in just about any country in the world.
What do you think's brought the number down?
I think that people are feeling more safe because there hasn't been a major terrorist attack in the United States. They aren't down in Israel, where you have frequent terrorist attacks, I think those numbers would jump right back up in the event of a major terrorist attack in the United States, as they would in almost any country. But I think beyond that, what you're looking at is that there are obligations that the government has to protect its citizens. And I think that that equation, the level of vulnerability or the level of fear in society, dictates to a large extent how a democracy is going to react. I think one of the great threats of this form of terrorist attack in a democracy is that it can overturn all approval of constitutional methods and rule of law. I mean, that potential is there in any free society.
Melissa, you want back on that?
Yes, exactly. I think that is a very important point to underline. We know, looking through history, that moments of intense public fearfulness are moments when democratic societies are most willing to make compromises with their fundamental commitments to human rights, to civil liberties. And that's precisely what we've seen. I think that the lesson we should draw from that is not that there's some kind of justification for violations of rights in times of fearful politics, but rather that we as democratic citizens have a special obligation in those times to be mindful of the things that we do in the name of national security when we're feeling afraid.
Okay, but I must tell you, every day we send out a notification to those who want to sign up to say what the subject of the program is going to be. So when the email went out today saying we were going to be doing torture/enhanced interrogation techniques, I had a number of people email me right away saying, you must ask the following: does it work? You must ask whether it works. So Rick, I'm going to you with that question. Does torture/enhanced interrogation at the end of the day work?
Yes.
It does.
It can.
It can.
And the reason I say that is because it has worked. And it depends on who's doing it, how well they do it, and a variety of other factors. But yes, if it didn't work, people wouldn't do it.
Well, there are sadistic people who enjoy the power of seeing other people suffer.
That's the difference. And you have to. And Melissa brought up the very good point. Why are you doing it? Are you doing it to inflict pain and humiliation, or are you doing it to extract information? Let me use a real life example. John McCain. Senator McCain was tortured at the hands of the North Vietnamese. He is against torture. He's against enhanced interrogation. He specifically wants waterboarding outlawed in the United States. He wants to expand the Army Field Manual to all branches of government. He maintains it doesn't work because it didn't work on him. It didn't work on him because the North Vietnamese didn't know what they were doing. They knew how to inflict pain.
So is he wrong?
Well, I think he is, because if they were effective at extracting intelligence information, they could have done it, but they were not effective. So in his mind, he believes it's not effective because it didn't work on him.
Ramin, if the idea is to so frighten or harm somebody that they give you the information that you want, do you have to conclude that torture works and therefore it needs to be part of the toolkit?
I don't think it's going to work, no, because I think torture is like death penalty. Death penalty has not been working for taking violence out of our societies by putting people on death row. It's the same with torture. I think that the problem with torture is that we think that it works and we can take information out of the people, but in the long run, it's actually degrading for not only for the victims, but also for those who practice torture.
Mark, one of the arguments we hear is that it is just as likely to provide bad information because people will say anything to avoid pain. How accurate is that?
I think that's true, and I think it's one of the big reasons why any information obtained in any kind of a coercive setting should never be allowed in a court of law to prosecute someone, because the idea is not to force somebody to confess to doing something, but there's no doubt that there are people and there are instances who will respond and give up information if they're frightened, if they're made uncomfortable, if they're tortured. That it doesn't always work, and in many cases it's the wrong way to go, but I think this would be a very easy issue if it were simply true that torture and coercion don't work. It does work. I can give you examples of it working.
It does work, or it can work?
It can work, and it has worked, and it does work in some cases.